Hey everybody, it's Ed. Hope y'all are doing great. This is a little bit of a different kind of episode. This is a Shed Session episode, and normally the Shed Session episodes are exclusively for Patreon supporters. I put this one out last month in April, and it was answering the question that I often receive, which I most of the time think I'm not qualified to answer, but I get the question a lot, so I decided to answer it, and that is something along the lines of, hey, I want to start a podcast. Do you have any advice? And I get a ton of emails and messages on Instagram and all that kind of stuff, and I can never do that question justice via an email or via some little DM on Instagram or whatever. And so I decided to record a podcast episode and just give you every single thing I know. And again, I really don't think I'm qualified to be answering that question, but I get it so much that I just wanted to answer it and I wanted to put it all out there. And so I recorded, it's 90 minutes of me sitting in the shed answering every bit of that question that I know how to answer. And so for better or worse, I put it out on the Patreon exclusive feed and got some really good feedback on it. And so I decided to put it out here on the main feed. I'm doing that for two reasons. One, I think it'll be helpful for folks who are looking to start a podcast similar to mine. If you're looking to start the next Smartless or Joe Rogan or This American Life, you can turn this off right now. This ain't going to be any help to you. But if you have seen what I've been doing in Mountain Prairie over the last 8 years and want to do something along those lines, hopefully this will give you a little bit of extra information that'll help. And then I also wanted to just give you a taste of what the Patreon exclusive podcast is like. It's generally a Shed Session episode, and I put one out every month. As of this moment, there are 6 Patreon exclusive episodes on the Patreon feed. And if you want to learn more about all that, you can go to mountainprairie.com/Patreon. So that's enough yapping from me. I hope this episode adds some value. Again, go to mountainprairie.com/Patreon to learn more. Thanks. Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ed here, and we are getting ready to go into another Shed Session. Confession on this one, though, I was getting all this junk set up to record this in the shed, and then the wind started blowing, and then there was some construction, so I moved the whole operation down to my basement. So you probably won't hear all the noise in the background that you normally do. But I want to do this Patreon podcast, and as I've been doing probably about half and half. I feel like about half I do book recommendations and things like that. And then the other half, I'm answering questions that I get a lot. And the first Shed Session I ever did was answering the question, how do I get a job in the conservation world? I think the title of it was Everything I Know About Getting a Job in the Conservation World, because that used to be the number one question that I got all the time. Nowadays, the number one question I get is something along the lines of, I want to start a podcast. How do I do it? Or can you give me some advice on starting a podcast? And first of all, as is the case with any questions I get, I'm always surprised that anybody thinks I know what I'm doing or thinks that I would have anything valuable to offer. But I did just hit the 8-year anniversary of Mountain Prairie. So whether or not I really know anything or not is debatable, but I've been doing it for a long time. And I have figured out some ways to go about it that have worked for me. And so a lot of times people reach out and they have these questions, and generally I just don't have the time to answer all of them. And even if I did, I think an email or a DM on Instagram or even like a 30-minute phone call probably wouldn't be sufficient for me to get all the information across that I want to get across when I'm talking about these things. So I'm going to do this podcast, and I've got 3 pages of notes here. And so hopefully it won't be too long. I'm going to do my best not to blab, but I'm also going to make this thing very, very thorough because I want to be sure I get all the information out there so that, if people have questions or have a desire to start a podcast or any sort of creative endeavor, for better or worse, they can download this thing and get all the information I know. And again, who knows if it's really, really valuable, but I'm just going to put it out there as a response to all the questions I get. This is a Patreon podcast, a Patreon exclusive podcast, but I'm going to, a few weeks or days after I put it out on Patreon, I am going to release it on the full feed. So if you're listening to this on the full feed and you want to support the podcast, you can go to mountainprairie.com/Patreon. and you'll get all the info you need to sign up for that. So let's get right into it. First of all, I'm going to give you an outline of what I'm going to discuss here. I just want you to know where this whole thing is going. Number one, I'm going to do some disclaimers, as I always do, and then I'm going to talk about why and how I started my podcast all the way back in 2016. I want to talk a bit about intentions. I want to talk about getting started, plus the endurance to keep going. Talk about finding your voice. Talk about finding an audience. Talk about the importance of generosity or being generous. Some interview techniques, some ideas on getting guests, what you do if you get negative feedback, equipment and editing. I'm going to talk a little bit about money and how that works, but as you'll hear, that's probably the least important thing you can think about if you're starting one of these things. And then I've got some readings, books, resources that may help as you go down this podcast journey. I will say that last year I did a course with the Free Flow Institute where we talked a lot about storytelling, everything from podcasting to writing to basically just figuring out a way to use stories to make the world a better place. And what I'm going to go through here is a version of one of my classes that we did on the Free Flow Institute course in the Green River. And I'm going to be doing another one of those Free Flow courses this August 2024 on the Rogue River in Oregon. So if you happen to get some value out of this, want more detail, it's basically 5 days of talking about this stuff nonstop. We have official classes, and then we also, we're spending time in the boat. We're just hanging out for 5 days, no cell service. And so in that course, I share stuff like this, as well as pretty much everything I know about all creative type endeavors. So that's Free Flow. All right, I'm going to start this thing out as I often do with these shed sessions with some disclaimers. I don't have to do the disclaimer about the loud noises and dogs barking and stuff like that because I'm in the basement. But as far as making a podcast, this whole thing is about my journey, how I did it. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just telling you how I did it. And I will say that if somehow you were able to completely exactly replicate everything I did, I can promise you 100% it wouldn't work for you. This is your journey. You've got your own interests. You've got your own skills. You've got your own talents. And so this whole thing is going to be, if you choose to go down this podcast journey, then it needs to take into account the way you want to do it. And so hopefully there are a few nuggets in here that you can get from me and you can apply, and then you go get some other ones from other people who know what they're talking about, and you can apply those. But in the end, this is just my journey. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. And it's probably at best case scenario, it could be about 20% right for you, I would guess. Another one, I have no background in media or media production or anything like that. I mean, I went to school. My undergrad was in econ. I got a grad degree in MBA finance, basically like a professional spreadsheet jockey. And I just started doing this thing on the side. And so when I started it, nobody knew anything about me outside of the world I was in, which was real estate. And even there, not many people knew about me. So I didn't really start with any sort of training or experience or expertise in the podcast world. And I'll also say Mountain Prairie is a great podcast, and it's got a really strong listenership, but it is not at all some kind of podcast juggernaut. It's not Joe Rogan or Smartless or anything like that. I mean, you hear about these podcasts getting millions and millions of downloads. That's not mine. It's a very niche podcast. It's a very specialized podcast, but it's got a very loyal following. And so I think that should be inspirational for people listening, knowing that you don't have to hit millions of downloads or hundreds of thousands of downloads per episode or anything like that to find something that, makes the world a little bit better and is something that is, a very fun project that you can do. So you'll hear me talk a lot throughout this episode about the importance of not focusing on downloads. And so mine is not at all, a super, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of downloads, all that kind of stuff. It's got downloads, but again, doesn't really matter to me. When I'm talking, I think a lot of times I say, you should do this, you should do that. And I'm not at all trying to give hard and fast rules. I'm just talking to you, the listener, as if we're having lunch together. And so when I say you should do this, I'm basically just telling you what I did. So again, you need to take all this info and sort through it and then figure out what works for you and apply that. All right. First part, how and why I started my podcast back in 2016. I think people who listen to the podcast a lot have probably heard me talk about this, but I figure I'd just go through it so you can kind of get an idea of why I decided to start this thing all the way back in 2016. So I was in the real estate business, selling ranches all over the West, and I moved out West in 2005. And along with that job comes a ton of driving. And so back in 2005, 2006, I started listening to podcasts all the way back then. I had an iPod. And so you could download podcast onto iTunes and then transfer those to the iPod. And then I would plug the iPod into my truck's dashboard, into the tape player. Remember those little, for those of you who were around then or paying attention then, there were these things you could plug into the iPod, and then it had like a tape thing on the end. Plug that into your the tape deck in your truck, and then you'd listen to podcasts. And so I would always listen to one called the Dirtbag Diaries, which was an outdoor one. And that was really the only one I think that I listened to. But that was when podcasts kind of entered my consciousness. And then I continued doing that. I went to grad school and lived abroad and all that kind of stuff, but continued selling ranches. And so probably right around like 2013, 14, podcasts started becoming more popular, and you could get them on your iPhone and listen. And so I was just listening to a lot as I was driving all over the place. I did a lot of work with Crested Butte Mountain Resort. So I was always making that drive from Boulder to Crested Butte, which is like 5 hours. And so I just cranked through these podcasts. And I realized that, first of all, I love interviews. I love listening to interviews. I used to love Charlie Rose. I would download Charlie Rose interviews onto my iPod and listen to those. And so I've always just really enjoyed interviews. And I realized that in my world of kind of ranch real estate, I was doing a lot of endurance running. I've always been interested in books. I just kind of would come in contact with interesting people, and I'd ask them to go out to lunch because I wanted to learn more about what they were doing, whether that was in the conservation world or just they were generally interesting people. And I had these amazing conversations with them. And so as I was listening to podcasts, and I would always listen to the Tim Ferriss podcast, and I really enjoyed kind of the format. It was brand new. It was so laid back, but you get a lot of really good information from it. And so I was like, man, I've got all these cool people that I have lunch with or that I get together with and have these amazing conversations, and then the conversation's gone. And I was thinking, I bet people would like to listen to those. Worst case, I'd like to have it recorded so that I could go back and focus on the books they said they recommended, or movies they said to watch, or things about their life. And so I just had that idea. I bet I could do that. And then I also started noticing that I operated in this kind of weird Venn diagram of different aspects of the American West. So like one day I'd be out on a ranch talking with a, fifth generation rancher. The next day I'd be in Boulder, where I used to live, and my next door neighbor, I always say this, and it's pretty much true, was what I would call a militant environmentalist. And I noticed that when it came to talking about the land, talking about the environment, talking about sustainability, the old school rancher who was probably on the right hand side of the political spectrum, and then the far, far left environmentalist, I felt like they shared probably 80 to 85% of the same values and cared about the same things, but it was just these weird political things that caused them to think that the other was an enemy. And so I just had this idea that when you cross over those two kind of circles, there's this part in the middle where there's so much in common. And I thought it'd be interesting to try to highlight that. And then you can kind of expand that out to whether you're talking about artists or writers. All these people kind of had this love of the American West. And again, I'm an outsider. I'm from East North Carolina. That's where this accent's from. And so I just felt like I kind of occupied this weird spot that a lot of people could probably identify with and might appreciate. And then there was a third reason, which I haven't really talked about much, but I was selling these ranches, and a lot of that business is marketing yourself. And I've never been good at cold calling people or giving some kind of slick sales pitch, or really just, I'm not good when it comes to transactional type things, which is probably one of the reasons it was good I got out of that business. But I had this thought that all right, I'll go to lunch with these people. I have these great conversations. I don't have a problem at all connecting with people and building relationships when it's this one-on-one conversation. When it comes to like actively seeking people out, I'm not that good at it. So I had this idea, well, if I'd started this podcast and people listening to it, they would understand that I'm a somewhat responsible, somewhat smart guy who has a real interest in things about the West. And they would, even without me knowing, they would get to know me. And then hopefully that would lead to them wanting to work with me on real estate stuff. And, that was kind of a far-fetched plan really. And it's such a long-term strategy. It's looking back on it, it's kind of silly, but it actually led to some pretty legit real estate business with really, really good people. Like because of the podcast, 100% because of the podcast, I ended up getting over 100,000 acres of land listed in Montana with one of the leading regenerative agriculture groups in the country. And so I ended up leaving and going into conservation before I sold it. But it worked, and it was a way for an introvert like me who doesn't like schmoozing to go out and get his name out in the world and let people understand kind of who I am without giving a slimy sales pitch. So those were the ways that those were the reasons I started doing it. And, so I started it, and I'll go into the details of all that, but I started the thing just me on my laptop computer, and I just reached out to 4 or 5 people that I knew. I was like, hey, I'm starting this podcast. Would you like to be on it? And they said yes, and Eric Glenn was the number one person I spoke with, and I met him at his office, and we recorded the podcast, and I put it out. And it was probably after the first 5 or 6, I don't know, maybe even like 7 episodes that I then decided to reach out to people that I didn't know and do interviews over the internet. And so I reached out to the photographer Stephen Smith, who now owns Onda CBD company. And he's been a great friend over the years. I reached out to the artist Nick Nicholas Coleman, who does amazing artwork. I read an article about him on the Filson magazine and just sent him an email. And he was like, yeah, we do it. And we had a great conversation. And so then I started doing more of these kind of virtual interviews with people I didn't know. And I made a commitment to myself. I'm going to try to do about an episode every other week, but I didn't really tell anybody that. That was just my goal. And I just started doing them and just kept doing them. And very, very few people listened at first. And I just really never paid attention to downloads or anything like that. I was enjoying it, so I just kept doing it. And it was probably after about 2.5 or 3 years of doing that. And I'm going to talk more about that need for endurance. But 2.5, 3 years after that, I got an email one day, and it was from somebody saying that they were at the Aspen Institute, and they were holding a 3-day conference about the American West, and wondering if I could come and interview the author Hampton Sides on stage in front of 500 people. And first of all, I thought it was a joke. I thought it was one of my friends messing with me. And then second of all, I just couldn't believe that people were listening to it to the point where they wanted to invite me to events. And then I was thinking, in my weird world and what I value and what I think is cool, the Aspen Institute is about the smartest group of people you can find on planet Earth. And so the fact they wanted me to come and interview my favorite author, who I'd never met, didn't have any connection to, on stage in front of all those people, I was like, shouldn't there be a kind of an intermediary step between this, maybe a local author at Barnes & Noble or something, and do that and then move up to the Aspen Institute. And so I went up there, and it was the craziest experience. And I met a lot of people who, like Dan Flores, Sarah Dant, all these amazing people that I'd read their books. They were kind of heroes of mine in the literary and history of the West. And next thing you know, I'm listed in the program next to them. It was just insane. And so it was at that point that I realized, all right, something is unique about this podcast. Nobody at the Aspen Institute is trying to do me any favors. And the fact that they wanted me to come and talk, it was just a sign that, all right, people are listening to this thing and you must be doing something right, or at least not making a fool out of yourself. So let's get serious about this. And so nothing much changed. At that point I was working at Palmer Land Conservancy as the conservation director, and I just continued to do one episode every other week, basically. Sometimes I do, 1 a week. Sometimes I'd miss 3 weeks, but it came out to about 25 episodes a year. And I was working full time. I could sneak away to record interviews every now and then, but most of the editing and all that kind of stuff was done at night. And I just kept cranking and cranking and cranking. And very slowly, I started getting different opportunities where I was getting paid for stuff. And it was just a very, very slow burn. It was always people approaching me. I never was out giving any sales pitches or anything. And it just built up and built up. And until July of 2022 is when I quit my real job as conservation director, which was bittersweet because I love that work and it's very important. But I had to make a choice because I had so many opportunities around Mountain Prairie, so many travel opportunities, so many events, week-long workshops that I couldn't do both. So that was when I decided to go all in on the podcast. And then after that, it continued to grow. So that's kind of my story and my trajectory. And again, you got to remember, it's been 8 years. And for the first 2.5 or 3, other than nice comments on social media or whatever, I didn't have any sort of indication that it was that it was going to turn into anything unique. I was just really, really, really enjoying it. And so I think there's a lot of lessons there. I'll hear from people who've been doing a podcast for a year or a year and a half or 2 years, and they're starting to get anxious about wanting to make money and that kind of thing. And I understand it, but I just never had that mindset. I read a book one time called The Geography of Bliss, and it was talking about happiness and the happiest and saddest countries in the world. And this author had his theory was that happiness comes from having extremely low expectations. And from the very beginning of this thing, I've had the lowest of expectations. So the fact that anybody listened or that I got invited to Aspen Institute, I mean, that would have been the greatest thing in the entire world. Or the first time somebody wrote me a check for $200 or something, like that would have been the greatest thing in the world. And so now that it's turned into what it has, where I can support my family on it, thanks in large part to you Patreon supporters, thank you. It's really just crazy. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Don't have any big expectations. And so that's kind of my story. So I want to talk a bit about intentions. If you have decided you want to start a podcast, I've spent a lot of time talking on the phone with people. Some I know, some that I don't know. And one of the things that I found recently, especially like in the last 2 or 3 years, one of the things that I found is that people very quickly within the first few questions start talking about how do you make money on it. And I've learned to just end that part of the conversation, because if you're going into the podcast world to make money, I'd go buy lottery tickets or something before I did that, or bet on sports, or I don't know, if you want to make money, there's a lot of easier ways to make money and a lot of more surefire ways to make money. I think going in the podcast business to make money is like, but the analogy I always say is, all right, you want to make money. Think about if you went to the guitar store, bought a guitar, you didn't know how to play the guitar, you bought it, and you're walking out to your car on the way home to start strumming your new guitar, and you're on the phone with clubs and venues trying to book gigs. Or, for example, you go to the art store. I want to learn how to do watercolors. And you buy some paper and watercolors and brushes and a book on how to do watercolors. And then on the way out the parking lot, you're calling galleries. Hey, you want to buy my stuff? I think about the podcast as a creative endeavor. I'm not a journalist. I don't know anything about journalism. I don't want to be involved in journalism. It sounds awful at this point. This is something where I'm following my own curiosity. And I think just like music, just like art, it takes a while to kind of, find your voice, which is what I'll talk about, down the road a little bit here. But I really think that if you're coming into this thing with the idea of making money, in my opinion, your intentions and your kind of priorities are skewed. I think you need to be coming into it because there's some curiosity that you're trying to explore, or there's some itch you're trying to scratch, or there's some message you have that you want to share with the world. I think, I talk a lot about Seth Godin, and he talks about, if you're really good at what you do, the world will find you and the money will follow. But I think if you come in exclusively focused on making money off of this thing, it's like if you came into the music business wanting to make money. And then next thing you know, you're copying just the most garbage pop stuff that's on the radio versus creating a unique voice that is you that nobody else can replicate. So my number one thing about intentions as you're thinking about starting a podcast, don't think about money. If I were you, I would approach it like with the idea of, I will never make $1 on this thing. Would I keep doing it? And that's another thing Seth Godin talks about. In one of his recent books, he's talking about this question that you'll hear people say, kind of a hypothetical question. If you could do anything and you knew you wouldn't fail, what would you do? And I've always thought that was kind of a dumb question, because I think the purpose and the fun of things is doing something hard that you don't know if you can do. But Seth Godin agrees, and he's like, no, that's the wrong question. The question is, what would you do even if you knew you would fail? And so I think when you think about any creative project, but in my world of what I do, podcast, you got to just think of it as you're exploring your curiosity. You're trying something out. This is a creative outlet that you can mess around with and, see what happens. But I would not be thinking about money right off the bat. And the other intention for me is that I found to be very valuable is you got to think about, like, who is the audience here? In my world, I've said this on the podcast a million times, but the audience is my 23-year-old self, is Ed Robertson when he was working at Merrill Lynch in Wilmington, North Carolina, wearing a suit, necktie, the whole deal, because that was just what I thought. It was a responsible job, good brand. You can make a lot of money, the whole thing. But I would sit there in that. I had an office, actually. I had a cubicle when I started, but then they put me in an office. But I'd be sitting there and I'd, go home at night and read Outside Magazine about all these interesting people. And I'm like, man, these people are a lot more interesting than the people I'm working with. And I'm not trashing Merrill Lynch. There are a lot of great people that devote their lives to helping people manage their money, and that's a very noble endeavor, but it didn't work with me. And so I would read about all these amazing people doing all this cool stuff, and I read all these books, and I want to be more like them. I want to do something like that. And so now through my podcast, I talk to those people, and I think about 23-year-old me, if there were podcasts back then, he could have listened to those interviews and learned from these people and read the books and done all this different stuff to kind of speed up the process of following a different path. And so that's been very important to me. And really every single thing that I put into the world, whether it's the podcast or my book recommendations, good news, whatever, it all kind of goes to this filter of, would the 23-year-old version of me who was seeking out information and seeking out kind of validation and some instruction and all this kind of stuff, would that guy benefit from this? And so, again, if you copied me and you're trying to direct stuff at 23-year-old Ed Robertson, I feel for you, because that would not work. But you need to figure out, who are you talking to? Who is this thing for? I think that's very important. So those are the intentions. The next thing, the next kind of subheading here is getting started plus endurance. And that's the bottom line with all this stuff. Take out intentions, take out anything. I said the equipment, whatever. You got to start. And you got to just start doing it. And you got to quit with the planning and quit thinking about it and quit discussing, in your mind, well, should I do this or that? Should I talk about this or that? Should I have a co-host or not? Where should I record it? What kind of microphone should I mean, if there's a choice between going down these rabbit holes of trying to figure out all the details or just turning on the voice memo thing on your iPhone and recording it, I would do the voice memo. You got to get started, because the reality is you're not going to know what you're doing until you're doing it. It's, I keep hammering you Patreon supporters on the updates, talking about jiu-jitsu. I just started jiu-jitsu like 5 months ago. I could read every book in the world on it. I could think about it. I could watch all the YouTubes, but I'm not going to learn it until I get in there and start getting roughed up a little bit and really start experiencing it. And I really feel like that is one of the most important things about podcast, or really any, painting, music, whatever. You just got to start. And it doesn't matter, because at the very beginning, nobody's going to be listening anyway. So you might as well use that time as a time to figure it out, find your voice, which I'm going to talk about more. But you just got to start. Forget about equipment. Forget about all that junk. And I'll talk about equipment in a minute, but you just got to get started. And so one thing that I would recommend doing is setting a goal for both the frequency and a number of episodes that you're committed to doing. So say like 20 episodes. I'm going to do 20 episodes no matter what. And I'm going to do them every other week. I would suggest that you don't tell people that you don't make some grand announcement. And I would especially recommend not saying you're going to do it every week, because really quickly that turns into a lot of stress. Even if you're really good at it, even if you got a team, whatever, producing an episode a week is hard. And so I would just not tell anybody what the frequency is going to be, not tell anybody how many episodes are going to be, but you have it in your head. And then you just start doing it. Don't make it a big deal. Just start doing it and commit to that. And if you say you can do 20 episodes, do 20 episodes. Because really, I feel like I didn't start hitting my stride knowing anything that I was doing until like 70 episodes. But y'all are all smarter than me, so you got to commit. And then as you're thinking about the format and kind of how the thing's going to play out, most of the advice I'm giving here is for interview-based podcasts. And I would say when you're figuring out how much time is involved between the preparation, the recording, the editing, and getting it out on the internet, you need that to be a reasonable amount of work. And so I would recommend very low editing, just it's a conversation done online. Because what I would think is that you need to be able to replicate this process. In my mind, the kind of the model I would use, you need to be able to replicate this process 100 times. Can I do this 100 times and not get burned out? I think a lot of people listen to NPR or some of these highly produced podcasts and think I could do that, and you could do that, but it's gonna destroy you, especially if you're a one-person operation. You're doing this thing at night while you're trying to have another job. You'll get 6, 7, maybe 10 of those done, and then you're just going to be burned out, because that is hard. I mean, it takes me a long time just to do these interview podcasts. I just had to edit one this week because my editor was out of town, and it was a very stark reminder of how much work goes into even just editing in a very, very minor fashion interview episodes. So be very mindful of what you're committing to and this process that you're going to be going through. Let me see here on my notes. Another thing about just getting started, don't obsess about a bunch of details. Don't obsess about the name or the thumbnail image or any of that kind of stuff. That's all details. For probably 4 or 5 years or more, I made this little thumbnail on PowerPoint. And it was a picture I'd taken at Crested Butte. I still use that same picture of the horse. And then I found some font that was kind of cheesy looking Western, wrote Mountain Prairie on there. It's not spaced out right, nothing. I just put it on the uploaded it and good to go. And so I think a lot of people can get real hung up on all these very specific details that in the end really don't matter. I mean, if you had an awesome podcast and you had a great listenership, and all you had was just a black square for your thumbnail, it would still work. It's about the content. It's about making the thing and doing the thing, and not all these little shiny details, kind of like the paint job on the car. That stuff does. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter, completely. But in the list of things that you need to be worrying about, that is very, very, very close to the bottom when it comes to just starting and building momentum. Another thing, as you're starting the podcast, I would recommend that you don't make a big deal about it. You don't do these grand announcements over and over and over. I'm starting a podcast on this day. Here's the trailer. They didn't even do trailers when I was, but here's the trailer, and get excited because here comes the podcast. I'm going to be doing it every week and this and that. I just start doing it. And once one's out, you tell your friend, and then you put out another one, you tell some more people, put on social media, whatever. But I think when you do these big announcements that I've got this big thing coming out, it can just create a level of stress and anticipation that I don't think is healthy. And in my experience, nobody gives a shit. I mean, I put mine out, nobody cared. And I'll see that happen now. People put them out and then it seems like there's a bit of a letdown, but people were extremely busy. And now in 2024 versus 2016, there's even more of this internet digital noise coming at you all day. And so even people that are excited for you and want to listen to podcasts and all that kind of stuff, it's just a blip on their radar. And so I would say just focus on getting it out and then promoting it. later. And I think, as I'll talk about in a little while, I think the back catalog of episodes is very, very powerful. And so when you're getting started, just kind of be chill about it. Hey, this is what I'm working on. I've even told people in the past, you don't even need to call it a podcast, because I think with the name podcast, people have there's some expectation that it's on a regular basis or whatever. You just say, hey, this little audio project I'm working on, we'll see what happens. Hope you enjoy it, and put it out. I think the less you can set yourself up to be disappointed and the less you can set yourself up to be stressed, the better. Because if you're like me, you're going to be doing this thing while you have another job. And the last thing you want is for a hobby that is supposed to be fun. Making podcasts is my version of playing the guitar. You don't want that to turn into some kind of stress thing, because work's stressful enough, family's stressful enough. All the stuff that comes with life is stressful. This is supposed to be fun. So don't be making big proclamations about this amazing project you're working on. Just do it for yourself and start cranking them out. And so I really, really think that when you're thinking about making a podcast, the endurance part of it is what separates people. So many times I used to get a ton of messages from people, and I'd either email or talk with them, and I'd go through all my crazy ideas about how you start a podcast, and they would start it, and then 5 or 6 episodes later, they'd quit. And so at that point is when I quit giving the advice, because it was kind of frustrating to see, because I understand life happens. Everybody's got different priorities. There is something about, you could start doing it and realize you don't like it. That's cool. But I think if it is something you want to do, there's no way around it. The only way that it's going to ever catch on in a way that's significant or reach the right people is you just got to keep doing it over and over and over and over. And for me, that was probably 3 years of over and over, every other week, over, until I got any sort of recognition. But as I said before, the recognition was like surprising, not expected, icing on the cake, because I was having fun in the process. And I don't know if I'd still be doing it now at the rate I am, but I might be, because I just enjoy it. I really, really just enjoy it. And so I think the less talk, the less stewing over details, the more action of making stuff and doing it again and again and again. And when I look at, all the creative folks I like, that's one of or that I identify with, or who have found some success in the tough world of being a professional creative, the common theme with all of them is that they've got endurance, and they just do it over and over and over again. And so in order to do that, you got to like it, and it's got to be fun, and you don't want to burn yourself out. So you see this all kind of like a big circle. And then again, I mentioned this a second ago, but the importance of the back catalog. With that endurance comes back catalog of essays, of episodes. So if somebody happens to find your podcast through you interview somebody that's well-known in some niche, they hear it because of that. Then they go to the webpage, and there's 20 or 25 episodes where they can scroll through and find other ones to listen to. If they go to the webpage and there's 1 or 2 episodes, odds are they're just going to keep moving. And I heard somebody say one time, and I don't know if it's true or not, given my opinion of myself, I'd say it's probably not, but they say it's true. So hold on a second. I've heard people say that people come to podcasts for guests and they stay for the host. And so if people connect with you as a host and appreciate your style, no matter what that style is, there are lots of people who will appreciate it if you are doing it long enough, then they'll just keep listening, and they'll grow to kind of know and trust you. And it's almost like the guest at that point they trust you to introduce you to people. It might be somebody that they don't, on the surface, they think, I don't know that much about. But if they know you and know your taste, they're like, well, I should probably listen to this because I've liked the other stuff this person's done. So that's the end of the section about getting started and endurance. Takeaways are, Cliff Notes: start right now and don't stop. Hold on, I got to drink water. All right, finding your voice. I remember, I think it was my 4th or 5th episode, I interviewed Brady Robinson, who was then the executive director of the Access Fund. And he had been my NOLS instructor back in 1999. And we've stayed in touch. I actually was texting with him yesterday. Really, really great guy. very wise guy. He's probably about 5 years older than me, but I remember he said when we were recording it, he's like, well, it's going to take you a while to find your voice. And I remember thinking, what are you talking about? It's just me talking. I don't know what he was talking about, but it's 100% true. And I feel like I'm still kind of trying to find my voice and get more confident and do it my way. But I think that goes back to the endurance part. The only way to learn and to make it yours is by doing it over and over and over again. And through that process, you're going to figure out what works and what doesn't. And what works for you and what doesn't work for you and what makes the guest the most comfortable. And so what I did when I started out it's kind of the exact opposite of finding your own voice or doing things your own way. I basically copied the format of a podcast I listened to a lot, which was the Tim Ferriss Show. And I pretty much copied his format exactly. And I haven't ever gone back and listened to those episodes, and I probably never will, because it would I can't even listen to the ones I do now. But I pretty much copied his kind of the framework of how he structured these things and started doing it. And then after probably 6-7 episodes, I started tweaking it a little bit. And I've continued that tweaking process. For people who've been listening for a long time, you might remember up until probably 2 years ago, I used to always ask people at the beginning, how would you describe what you do? And that was kind of the way I always started. And then I just realized there's no point in asking that. I mean, I just kind of moved on from that. And so the structure and the tone and the details of how you go about doing the podcast will change over time. But if you're kind of stumped and don't know how to get started, just find one you like and copy it. Don't straight up plagiarize or anything like that. I've had people do that actually. Basically 100% plagiarize or 80% plagiarize stuff that I've written when they've started podcast. And I guess that what do they say about people copying you as a form of flattery? I didn't really like it at the time, but they have since quit it. So anyway, I think that finding a template you like and following that is a good way to get started. Another thing that I heard Tim Ferriss say at one point was that when he puts out an episode, he would want, in his ideal world, there'd be like 10% of his listeners who would absolutely love it, just absolutely love it. 50% that would be like, yeah, that's pretty good. And then 40% that have no interest at all in what he's talking about. And given the wide range of topics and types of people that I talk with, I've kind of always thought about that. Like maybe, if I'm talking to some very specific conservation person who does water work in a very specific region of the West, they're probably only 10% of the listeners really, really are super interested in that specific subject. But there's a lot of them that may not be interested in that subject, but they're interested in learning about this person and what they do. And then there's probably a lot of people that just don't even listen to it. And I think that's kind of a good way. You can't be everything to everybody, and you can't, you're not going to be batting 1,000 with every single one of your listeners. And so I think having some variety and having, knowing that everything is not going to connect with everybody, I think that's fine. I do think that there is a very important part of this, which is putting some constraints on the project. For example, my podcast is about people in the American West. Again, that's very, very loose, but just having those kind of brackets around it or those walls around it, the American West, there's a certain person who loves the West who would be interested in that. I very well could call it just long form interviews with interesting people and not even talk about the West. But I think there's so many podcasts like that. When you're describing it to somebody, how is that special? How are you going to capture anybody? I mean, I think a lot of people want to do that, and that's basically what I do. But I think this idea of having some sort of constraints on what you're doing and who it's for is important, if for nothing more than being able to describe it to people and get people to want to listen. Again, about finding your voice, I hit on this earlier. In the very, very beginning, as you're starting doing this, I would just be very prepared from the day one, or even from the first idea about this, that nobody's going to listen to it. I mean, maybe some friends, when you put it out, it'll be friends and people because you put it on social media, and maybe some of the guest friends. But otherwise, just make up your mind and be happy that not many people are going to be listening, because you're going to be learning as you go. And hopefully when you look back, as I do, on the early stuff, you'll be like, man, I didn't know what I was doing. That was pretty bad. I'm glad I've gotten so much better. And I think that's going to be the case. And so you need to not come in with some high expectations that you're going to be on the Apple iTunes charts or whatever at the beginning, because in a way you don't want that, because then you're trying to figure this thing out while you got a big audience. So I think starting knowing that it's going to be a small audience is good. I found some stat before I started recording this, and it said that you are in the top 50% of podcasts if your episode gets 32 downloads. So that's not a lot of downloads. I'm not big on paying attention to downloads, but 32 is not much. So you think that's the middle. That's like the middle of the bell curve. So a lot of podcasts are getting 5 listens or 10 listens or 2 listens or whatever. So just know that's the reality, and that's probably how it's going to go. That's how it went for me. No, I mean, nobody listened to my thing for years. I remember one time I looked in the stats after maybe like 2 years, and one of them had been blasted out on some email list, and it got 600 downloads, and I could not believe it. I could not believe it. I thought it was like winning the lottery. And it made me really nervous, because I'm like, oh no, all these people are listening to it, and I probably sound so stupid. But again, it's not about me. It's about the 23-year-old version of me. And speaking of stats, as you're finding your voice, I wouldn't even look at them. I still barely look at them. If I have to, when I upload episodes, there's the page that comes up, has all the stats, but I kind of like cross my eyes so I don't have to look at them, and I get to the upload page and fill it out. I don't want to know anything about the stats. I mean, if it's getting a lot, great, whatever, but it's not going to change whether or not I stop doing this or start doing this. And a lot of the financial aspect, the way I've built the business around it, downloads don't really matter. I mean, if there's some website that ranked Mountain Prairie as in the top 0.5% of all podcasts, so that's cool. But as far as the actual numbers, looking at them all day long, it's like looking at a stock portfolio as it goes up and down with the market. There's nothing you do about it. Don't waste your time on that. Waste your time on producing good stuff. Hold on, I need water. The other thing about finding your voice is, I think interview-based podcasts reward authenticity and enthusiasm. The thing about these unedited long-form conversations, you get a real feel for both the guest and the host. And I think people are drawn to people that are enthusiastic and that are authentic. And so the more authentic you can be, and the more enthusiastic you can be, and you probably can't, learning to be authentic can be hard. And learning to put yourself out there and just be yourself can be hard, but the enthusiasm should come pretty naturally. Because if it's the kind of thing that you want to be exploring and that you want to be learning about, then the enthusiasm will be natural. And if you find yourself, thankfully I haven't been in this situation, but you find yourself talking to somebody that's super boring, or like if you were forced to talk to somebody or something, I think a longstanding guest would be able to tell a difference in your level of enthusiasm. So I think that that's very important. And so I think the enthusiasm comes if you've picked the right thing that you're truly interested in. The authenticity takes time. As you get positive feedback, as you get better at it, as you kind of learn what you're doing, you can become more and more authentic. And I think as part of being authentic, it's an imperfect deal. Me being myself, or the best version of myself on the podcast, I just, like I said, I had to edit that episode the other day, and I heard all the weird, just all these things that, and even some of the stories I tell and stuff, they're very strange, and it's very strange to listen to, but I'm pretty confident that I'm being myself and that I'm being authentic. And by me being authentic, the guest, I think it kind of gives the guest like a subconscious permission to be their authentic self. And then I think the listeners appreciate it. I think the worst thing people can do, whether you're a host or a guest, is try to put on a show. Try to be somebody you're not. I'm not a journalist. I'm not Terry Gross. I don't know how to ask questions in a real serious way. I just want to have conversations. And what I've learned over a long time is that that's great and that's fine. And I've found through the power of the internet, people that seem to appreciate that. I mean, even you listen to this right now, I'm sitting here in my basement yapping, and I'm guessing if you made it this far, you're appreciating what I have to say. And it's not for everybody. It's not for the vast majority of humanity, but there's this very, very small group of people that it works for them. And so I would encourage you, as you're thinking about these things, that the quicker you can be your authentic self and the quicker you can just be confident in who you are, the better. I always tell guests when we're recording, nowadays guests start getting nervous before, which is funny because it's just me in this basement recording these things. And I'm like, what? You don't need to be nervous. I said that there's only one way you can screw this thing up, and that's if you decide to put on a show and act like somebody you're not. And so I think whether you're the guest or interviewing, the most important thing is just to kind of leave the ego aside and be yourself. When I met up with Nick Offerman at his wood shop in LA and we did our episode, afterwards we were talking about, I was asking him if he gets nervous before he does things. And he said, not anymore. And I was saying, I still get nervous before these things. And I just don't want to sound like an idiot. I want to do a good job for you and all this stuff. And he said, well, the thing you need to remember is that when you're dealing with creative stuff and you're dealing with art, it's the imperfections and at times like the clumsiness is what makes it unique. And there's only one person on earth that can produce Mountain Prairie, and that's you, Ed, is what Nick was saying. And he was talking about his friend Jeff Tweedy, or all these different artists that he deals with, and all of in himself, and all of it is imperfect, and it can be clumsy, and it can be not perfect, but that's where the magic is. That's what makes it unique. That's why people, the people that you find that it connects with, that's why they listen. They're not listening to hear an FM morning drive DJ talking in a weird voice, or somebody trying to act like they're really smart and wise, or somebody, they're not looking for a show. They're looking for you. And it can be kind of hard to get your head around that. It has been for me. But once you do realize that, I think the whole thing becomes a lot easier. And with that comes the confidence. As I've gotten more positive feedback and more people where the podcast seems to mean something to them, it's given me more permission to be my authentic self. And there is a thing about authenticity. I talk about this on my free flow trip. Authentic is kind of a tricky word because I'm being authentic with you right now. I'm just sitting here reading my notes and talking to you, but the authentic version that my wife sees is not what you're hearing now, or the authentic me that's talking to my best friend and we're making fun and using foul language and telling crazy jokes. That's very authentic, but it's not what you're hearing now. And so I think somebody on my free flow trip really had a great idea. I was like, I don't know how you define authentic. And she said, well, I think it comes down to your values. And if you have values in place and you're living according to those values, no matter who you're talking to, then that's being authentic. And so I think thanks to people like you supporting the podcast on Patreon, it's given me kind of permission to lean into being myself. So thank you for that. All right, next part is finding an audience. My audience, I found my audience, or they found me, because other than spending some money on Instagram ads just as a experiment, I've never paid for any sort of marketing. And so every single bit of the spread and growth of Mountain Prairie has been word of mouth. And I think a lot of that comes from the guests have a good time, and I do my best to, let them show the best version of themselves, and then they are proud to share it with their friends. And so that's how mine has worked. And so for me, that's really revolved around making the interviews positive. I'm not going to shy away from difficult subjects or things of substance, but at the same time, I'm not some kind of 60 Minutes recorder that's trying to start a reporter that's trying to start an argument with somebody or trying to debate with somebody. I just want to talk to those people, and I want to learn both what they do, but probably more importantly, why and how they do what they do. And so I think there is a market. I think my podcast is proof to me that there is a market for positive talk and not this inflammatory name calling and all that kind of stuff. And I've actually decided that I'm not dealing with politicians anymore, at least politicians that are running for office, because that you're not having a authentic conversation. They're trying to, get their points across, and a lot of those points are talking shit about the other side, whatever side you're on. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in just these laid back, fun conversations, learning how people do what they do. And so Seth Godin talks a lot about the need to find a minimum viable audience. And so you don't want to be looking for the Joe Rogan audience or the This American Life audience, which is millions of people is everybody. You want to find the smallest possible audience that shares your values, shares your interest, that will support whatever you're trying to do. And I don't mean support financially. I just mean give you the energy to keep making the podcast. If you've got 20 people that absolutely love what you're doing, that might be enough for you to keep doing it. Some people need 20,000. If you're trying to make money on it, it's a whole different deal. But you need to think about who is the minimum viable audience for this thing, and then you kind of serve those people. And so I think that's a really important concept. And some of the books I recommend at the end of this talk about minimum viable audience. And I think as the podcast grows and as people listen, and then as you talk to more and more guests, your network grows. And then those people share, listeners share with other listeners. Podcast guests will introduce you to other potential podcast guests. And it just creates this momentum that is that really gets going. But again, all this goes back to that same idea of it requires endurance, it requires consistency, it requires doing it for a long time. None of this is going to happen over the course of 5 episodes or even probably 20 episodes. You just got to keep cranking. And another thing, I kind of already alluded to this in finding an audience, but you need to really appreciate the fact that this is not for everybody. In fact, it's not for most people. Most people will not connect with what you're doing. And mine is such a niche, very, very niche subject. Cool people doing cool work in the American West. And even within that niche, for the people that listen, they're probably half of the episodes are not for committed listeners. And that's not bad. It's not for everybody. And that's why it's good. That's why you can find that minimal viable audience. That's why you can find this really cool niche, and you focus on that and you ignore everything else. I rarely get negative feedback, but if I do, my answer is, if it's not, I generally don't respond to negative feedback, and I'll talk more about that. But the answer in my head, and I've said it a few times, is either 1, opinions vary, obviously, or 2, well, it's not for you. I'm sorry. I didn't, there must have been a misunderstanding here, because this podcast is not for you. You don't connect with it. I don't know. Sorry, there's some confusion here. I didn't make this for you. And I'm not trying to be a jerk or a tough guy or arrogant or anything, but that's just the truth. It's not for most people. And I think, getting that in your head is a very powerful thing as you try to find your voice. And then I think, as far as promotion, you want your listeners to be your biggest promoter. There's this book that I'm going to recommend at the end called The Idea Virus by Seth Godin. And you want people who are going to be your promotional people, because what you are doing creates value. And that's what I've done. And it's just spread and spread and spread, very similar to a virus. So you can read more about that when I go through the books. Another important heading here is the importance of generosity. Again, this is a Seth Godin idea, or an idea I got from Seth Godin. But he always talks about when you're making creative work or putting work in the world, it should be put out with a spirit of generosity. And that's what I've done with my podcast. When I put it out, it is, again, back to the 23-year-old Ed, that is aimed at that guy. Here's some tools. Here's some information. Here's some resources that might help you. But when you think about the real audience, the people that are listening, I really want this thing to add value. I don't want it to be me just blabbing as I'm doing right now, but hopefully this is adding value. I want them to walk away from that podcast with having learned something and having some resources to continue to learn on that subject. That's one of the reasons from the very beginning that I've spent a lot of time, and now it's a lot of money, on the episode notes. If you go to the website, there are extensive episode notes for all the episodes, and you can go back, all the way to the beginning. And so that website, mountainprairie.com, is basically like a library with all of these amazing resources from all these amazing people. And that takes a lot of time. It took me a ton of time to do that. When I just had to edit this podcast the other day, that was the hardest part. It's crazy. Linking in and all this kind of stuff, linking all these websites. But I really do think that has been one of the reasons that has made people want to listen, because they'll be listening. They hear a book recommendation and they know they can click through the little thing in the episode notes, go to the web page, and everything that was mentioned is listed and linked. And that's a generosity thing. I guess I get listeners out of that, but when I started, I didn't. It was just this thing like, if I'm going to do this, I want it to be helpful. And so I'm going to invest time so that this thing adds value. And again, that was within the constraints of knowing I can repeat this process 100 times. It wasn't crazy over the top. Even my timestamps now are a little off because of time reasons. I estimate them. And I'm not going to ever get more focused on that, at least unless I have like a full-time editor. But those episode notes are non-negotiable. They're always in there. Thank you, Sam Hinkle, my editor, for doing those for me now. And I think another thing, whether you're thinking about the podcast or your relationship with guests or whatever, is have no expectation of reciprocity. Don't expect that, hey, I'm putting this person on my podcast. They have the obligation to share it with their networks. I've never had that thought with it's nice if they do, but if they don't, that's fine. I'm doing the podcast to help them tell their story, to produce something that they're proud to share, that helps tell the story of the cool work they're doing and help spread that to a broader audience. And that's it. No strings attached. If they want to promote it, that's great. Like the Nature Conservancy, for example, I've done my year-long, now almost year-and-a-half-long partnership with them. And just this year, they created this really awesome webpage on the Nature Conservancy website that has all the TNC partnership episodes. And it's awesome. It looks better than Mountain Prairie website. But there was no expectation that would happen. I mean, we had a business deal with a contract, the whole thing. But I just was like, I'm here to tell these stories about y'all's people. End of story. And then they went above and beyond to create this amazing website that drives a ton of traffic to my website. And I think that's just across the board. I think people can tell if you're doing things because you want to be transactional. Hey, you come on this podcast and then I expect you to promote my stuff, or you do this and that. And I think if you just really have it in your head from the beginning, I'm doing this to help. I'm doing this with the spirit of generosity, no strings attached. Do whatever you want. And that's the same with my book recommendations email, same with my good news email. I just, the good news, I just use it to spread the word about cool stuff and cool stuff my friend's doing. And one time I got an email recently, somebody's like, how much does it cost to get on the good news email? I was like, actually, it costs me money because I got to pay MailChimp all this money every month because I'm sending this email out to so many people. It costs you nothing. You just tell me the cool stuff you're doing and I'll put it on. And so the same with my book list, but that book list has led to, endless amazing interviews. Like the Chris Tompkins interview was a long time result of that book email list that's connecting me with all these publishers and everything. So again, generosity. Don't be thinking, what can I get out of this thing? What can I do for other people? Generosity is covered heavily in all of Seth Godin's stuff. So you get more than you need by reading his books. All right, next one, interview techniques. People always ask me about interview techniques, and the bottom line is I don't have an interview technique. I want to talk to people. And if I'm not interested in them or what they're doing, they're not going to be on the podcast. And so just by the very fact that we're connected and they want to come on the podcast, I want them on the podcast, it's going to be a conversation. I mean, I prepare a ton. I have tons and tons and tons of notes. I spend a lot longer than the interview getting ready for the interview. But when we hit record, or from the moment I start talking to them, even before we record, it's just conversation, just shooting shit, having a low-key conversation. And so there are a few individual techniques that I'll tell you that I do that seem to put people at ease. Because a lot of times, these people that I've had on the podcast, it's the first time I'm ever meeting them or talking to them is when we're recording the podcast. If there's some of these very heavily conservation focused ones where we're talking about specific projects, sometimes we'll do calls before just so I can make sure I understand it properly. But most of the time it's like we get on the computer, if it's a virtual deal, and we're talking, and they've never talked to me before. And so one of the things that I do that I would recommend you do if you want a podcast like mine is I tell them in the email beforehand, and then I tell them in person, and I repeat it over and over, is, hey, look, I'm not trying to ask any questions to make anybody uncomfortable. I want to talk about stuff that is of substance and that's inspirational and that's fun, but I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not here to debate you. I'm not here to ask you questions you don't want to answer. And so just know that if I ask anything you don't want to answer it, just tell me and we'll cut it out, no problem. And another thing is, know that when the whole thing's over with and we're done and we hang up, if tonight you're falling asleep and you're like, oh man, I wish I hadn't have said that person's name, or I wish I hadn't have said a specific thing, just send me an email, call me, and I'll cut it out. No problem. You can talk, speak freely, knowing that, we can never add stuff in afterwards, but we can always cut stuff. So just let it all go, let it all rip, knowing that I have your best interest in mind. And that's not something like 60 Minutes or whatever would do, but I'm not 60 Minutes. I'm trying to spread the word about these amazing people and what they're doing. So that really puts people at ease, because I think a lot of people think it's like what you see is what you get, and it's almost like it's live, and that's not the case. Rarely, if ever, maybe like 5 times total have I ever done that, and it's all been just probably could have stayed in and it'd be fine. But it really makes people feel better knowing that I give them kind of, quote, final cut, I guess is what you would call it. I used to send people all the questions, like all my notes, and I found that it was overwhelming and it made people nervous. So now if I send them anything, it's a brief outline of what we're going to talk about. And then that gives me room to kind of go where I want to go. It doesn't make them overwhelmed. I found if you give people questions ahead of time, they prepare answers. And then the answers, you can tell they're prepared and they're not as authentic. And so I just want it to be a conversation. And so I will send people outlines. I always let them know that I'm going to ask about books, and I'm going to ask them for kind of parting words of wisdom. But otherwise, at most, an outline, because I don't want them to get nervous. I don't want them to prepare too much. I want it to be a conversation. I already said this, but my podcast is not a debate. I'm not trying to argue with people. Every now and then when I have a guest on, I'll get some comments on Instagram or, some emails from some people or whatever. Like, why didn't you ask them about this? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Kind of these like accusatory things. One guy got real mad about, I won't go into it in case he's listening because I don't want to give it oxygen, but like real mad about something I failed to ask so-and-so. I didn't even respond, but it's like, man, have you listened to these things? This is not I'm not trying to rip people a new one on here. I got no interest in that. I'm trying to have positive conversations. So I think that is, I think that's really important to know and to focus on. And I think it creates, people who listen to podcasts has been around long enough now that people kind of know what they're getting if they come on. If it's somebody who's never listened, I have to explain it a little bit. But for people who listen, they know exactly what they're getting. And that leads to more guests. It leads to people being comfortable. It leads to people wanting to be on it because it's going to be this great representation of all the cool stuff they're doing. They trust me. And so I think by going into some kind of podcast where you want to argue with people and call people out and, show them that you're right and they're wrong, maybe that'll work, but I wouldn't listen to it. And I don't know many people who would. And there's enough of that in the world. But hey, man, if that's your passion in life, let her rip. You'll find your audience. You really will. It won't be me though. All right. Those are interview techniques. Oh, and last thing on that, which I've already said, but you want to make something, you want to tell them that you want to make something that they want to share. The reason my podcast has grown as it has is because people want to share it. And so I always tell people, like, the point of this thing is to highlight all the cool stuff you're doing. That's it. And I think that puts people at ease. All right. Getting guests. I always get a lot of questions about this. All I can do is tell you how I did it. And that is, I started with my friends. I just started with people I knew, and then it expanded out from there. And that worked really well. When I am getting guests and lining up guests, I've found for me personally that if I can do the interview in person, I enjoy that a lot more, and it seems to put people at ease a lot more. The online ones are great, and the technology for all that stuff has only improved over the years, and it's gotten better and better and better. But when I can do it in person, I will. And I've, at this point, it used to be every now and then I'd reach out to people cold who I didn't know. Like I was mentioning Nick Coleman. I didn't know him. I reached out cold. Even like Teal Blake, who's become a great friend, the artist, I reached out to him cold. But now after, 8 years, it's gotten to the point where I rarely are introductions cold. Mostly they're friends of friends, or somebody introduces me to somebody, and that just speaks to the power of the network. I do get a lot of requests, daily, constant requests from people via my website saying they want to be on the podcast, or they know somebody that can be on the podcast. And I take note of all those. But at this point, there's just not enough time. If I did 4 episodes a week, I still wouldn't be able to get through all the requests that I have. And so what started with me calling up a few friends and then nervously emailing people I didn't know has transformed into having more than I can deal with. And that's all just because of the power of the network. Network is everything. If you want to hear more about my thoughts on the network, you listen to that one, the Shed Session about how to get a job in the conservation world. I get all these emails, and I don't know what the deal is, but they're from these companies like, we provide podcast guests and we can get you hooked up with famous podcast guests or this and that. And I've just always never understood what the market for that is, because it's almost like, it seems to me that somebody's like, I got a podcast, I want to start a podcast and I need guests, and this company will send them to me. And it's almost like the guest doesn't matter as much as just like filling the space and getting an episode out. And for me, like, I've got a long list of everybody I'm going to talk to, and even people that are way outside of anything I could ever imagine talking to now, but I want to talk to them. And the idea of just having a guest for a guest doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't know. I just got one of those emails before I started recording, so I wrote that down. But the guests will come, but I would say start with friends and start with people you know, and then go from there. All right, got a few more headings here. Negative feedback. The great thing about Mountain Prairie, one of the many, many, many great things about it, is that 99.999% of the feedback I get is positive. Again, because it's not for everybody. The podcast is not for everybody. And so if somebody has invested the time to listen to these long episodes that are kind of weird with me stumbling and mumbling, to get to the end of that, you got to like it. And so very rarely do I get negative comments. And I've heard all this stuff. I've heard from different people and people who've been trained in this stuff about there are all these techniques about how to deal with negative comments and how to deal with criticism and all this kind of stuff. And I'll say I'll take criticism from people that I trust, and I welcome criticism from people I trust. But from the average person on the internet that I don't know, I don't care one bit. It still stings me, I think, and I still do see most of it, but I've trained myself to not care and I refuse to engage with it. And if I see negative stuff, whether it's emails or if it's comments on Instagram, whatever, I delete the comment, and depending on how bad it was or whatever, I block them forever. And I don't even think twice about it. And if I get a negative email, I have Gmail, so not only do I archive it, but I delete it completely so that I don't have the option of responding to it. Because sometimes if I get a negative one, I'll go through all these things in my head about how I want to straighten this person out and this and that. And by deleting it and not even knowing who the person is, it doesn't give me the option to engage. There's some quote that I heard one time about dealing with kind of angry people or narcissists, or just, kind of people that want to argue. And it said, if you're going to wrestle with a pig, 2 things are going to happen. You're going to get dirty, and the pig's going to love it. And I feel like people who are making comments on social media or firing off angry emails, they don't want to have a conversation. And even if they did, I don't have time for that. They just want to fire something off. They want a little scrap. They want to get into it with somebody. And I'm just, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not playing that game. My stuff is positive. Again, it's not for everybody. If it's not for them, they can move on. Don't quit listening. And I'll tell you, I get a lot of all the things I do. The one that gets the most consistent negativity, which is very, very little, but every time, is my book recommendation email. And I get a lot of comments from people coming back with all these very strong opinions about the books that I recommend. And so I used to respond to some of them, and now I just delete them. I don't even know who these people are, and so they're probably still getting the emails because I never see their name, really. I delete it so quickly. But it's like, hey, man, this is free for you, and just unsubscribe. And then I would recommend you start your own email list. But it's just not worth it to get involved in debates. If you're doing some kind of political thing where debates is part of it, great. But what I'm doing, I'm not here to debate. I've got the very positive intentions in everything I do. And so if anybody wants to be negative, they can just, take that somewhere else. It's going to be like yelling into the Grand Canyon because I'm not going to respond. So these last three, or these last two, are probably the least important. That's why I saved them for the end, but they are questions I get. So I'm going to answer them real quick. And the first one is equipment and editing. And then the second one is money. For equipment and editing, I have a spreadsheet that I've sent to people who've asked me this, and it's all the equipment that I use. I got a copy of it right here. I've got a different setup for in-person, and it's all very, very, very simple. Nothing fancy. None of these boards you see that have all the dials and the lights and all this kind of stuff. None of that. It's just it's called a Zoom H6 recorder, and then I use Shure microphones. This is for in-person with microphone stands. And then for over the internet, I use, let's see what it's called. I don't even know what any of this stuff's called. It doesn't matter. ATR 2100 USB microphone. And so I'll link to this spreadsheet so y'all can get in there. It has links to them. It has the price. I think the whole setup of everything is $500 for everything. And let's just make it be known that for the first 65 episodes, even in person, I had one USB microphone. I'd plug it into my computer, and there was one microphone for two people. So I did that for basically 3 years, 2.5 years. So you don't need all the fancy equipment, but over time I've upgraded, but I still don't have, as far as microphones and all that stuff. I think this microphone I'm using right now cost, let's see, $42.99. So you don't need to worry about it. I see people who are starting podcasts, and they have a microphone. I look it up. It's like $500. I'm like, shit, man, that's some fancy stuff. My thought on all this audio stuff is I want it at 90%. I'm not looking for NPR quality. I'm not looking for anything. I want it at 90%. I want it so that it's not distracting for people to listen to. There's not a lot of clicking or anything like that, but it's good enough to people to listen to. They know it's a podcast. I'm not an audio engineer. If you're looking for that, then this podcast is not for you. I use a hosting service called Libsyn. For the longest time, I used SoundCloud, but then I upgraded to Libsyn because they allow you to put links in there. There are a million different platforms to choose from. When I'm doing these podcasts virtually, I use a program called Zencastr, which is great. You can also record video on that, but I don't do it. And the thing about Zencastr, and there's another one called Riverside, the thing that's so great about those programs is that they record the audio locally on the both computers. So like if I'm talking to somebody in California, if we're on Zoom, everything's recording on my machine. So if the connection gets bad, scratchy, whatever, it records as scratchy and bad. But on Riverside, it records it onto their machine and then uploads it, and then records mine on my machine and uploads it. So you get these two audio tracks that were recorded locally. So even if the connection gets bad, the audio sounds perfect. And so it requires a little bit more editing because it's two different tracks. I used not to do 2 tracks, but my man Sam handles all that now. And I would highly recommend doing that. I mean, I have found for really rural connections, like if somebody's out on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, Zoom is the best just because, or Skype, because it doesn't require as much internet to sound good. But if you're dealing with somebody in a city with regular internet, I've had great luck with Zencastr. I have started backing it up I've got a program called Audio Hijack that basically creates a backup of everything, all the audio going through the computer. I had one problem with Zencastr where I had two people I was interviewing, and so we had 3 tracks, mine and those 2 people, and one of those 3 tracks was missing like the last 20 minutes, and they couldn't figure out what went wrong. And so from then on, I paid the money for this thing called Audio Hijack, and I do a backup. Never had to use it since then, but it's good to have because these things can break. For editing, I use GarageBand on my MacBook Pro, and that's what I've always used. I think Sam uses some fancy program that he knows how to use, and the product is better. But when I was doing it myself, and then when I did one myself this week, GarageBand, right there on the Mac. It works fine. The secret sauce I've found for all, whether in person or virtual, is there's a program called Auphonic, Auphonic. And it's been around since I started my podcast. And basically what it does is it does all the like audio engineering. So inevitably one track is going to be louder than the other. One person's voice is going to be louder than the other. It's how it always is. Auphonic evens everything out, and it's only gotten better over the years. Now there's a thing where that's associated with it, where it can kind of smooth out echoes. So like somebody's got a real echoey recording set up, they're sitting in a room with wooden floors and all that kind of stuff. It makes it sound like it's not echoey. They just introduced that feature, but you can use it for free for like 2 hours a month or something. I think I pay like $9.99 or something, but that is the key. Sam does a little bit on his end, but even when he sends me the finished product, I run it through Auphonic and it just smooths everything out. So you don't need all these programs that require you to be twisting dials and pushing stuff up and down. You don't need doing that. You upload this thing to Auphonic, and literally 3 minutes later, it spits out a completed project. One time I recorded one in person. I got the new equipment. This was like episode 65 when I got the new in-person mics. I didn't know how to record it. I didn't know how to work it. And I got home and it was so quiet, I couldn't even hear it. I could barely hear it. And I was like, I screwed this thing up. Oh no. I put it in Auphonic, came out perfect. So that's the key to good quality sound. So again, you don't need to go crazy with this stuff. All right. Next to last subject is money. And I saved this to the end because it's the least important thing. And if you're thinking about money, you probably shouldn't start a podcast. I mean, you'd be better off trying to be like a visual artist or make films or something. I mean, it's a long haul to start making money on a podcast for something that's supposed to be fun. And so I really don't talk about specifics of money anywhere. I do on my Free Flow Institute course. I go into great detail about kind of the business side of things and how I've gone about creating models that allow me to make money without having to go with the traditional advertising method. But I would say that you want to avoid trying to sell ads or anything like that for as long as possible. My friend Rick Wittenbreaker of Howler Brothers, who was on the podcast, there was a point maybe 4 or 5 years ago where I was like getting anxious and like, I'm going to start selling ads. He was like, man, don't do that. Don't do that. You don't want to start doing that because pretty quickly you're just turning into an ad salesman. And if you are following the traditional advertising model and you've got a relatively small podcast, you're going to be spending the vast majority of your time going around begging for like $200-$300. And you're going to have to do that over and over and over and over again. And so on my Free Flow course, I go into all the detail about how I've found a way to make this whole thing manageable and make money that is outside of the normal advertising model. So you can come on Free Flow if you want to hear all the details about that. But I will say that I think having a podcast and making money is kind of like having a bookstore and making money. You don't want to just be relying on selling books. You want it to be a community center. For a bookstore, you want to be a community center. You want to have a coffee shop. You want to have events, blah, 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 blah. Books is one part. And that's how it is for me with the podcast. I make some money through partnerships, and every now and then I'll do ads if it's right. But then I've got Patreon, which, thank you again. I do a lot of events, and that's become a big kind of source of revenue. What else? I've got these adventures like the Free Flow or the Strenuous Life Retreat. I've started getting hired to be a speaker at events. I even get some affiliate money from books, whether that's sold on Amazon or bookshop.com. Hopefully I'm working on a book proposal, so I'm hoping that a book deal will be a big part of that revenue. But I remember when I was in the financial planning business, there was some analogy people would use, talk about you want to diversify. And like if you live next to a golf course and you got a big window looking out over the golf course, it's probably better to have like 16 panes, 4 by 4 by 4 by 4, or versus just one big window. Because if a golf ball comes flying through there, it's better that it just breaks one of the little panes instead of the whole thing. And I think for a podcast like mine, with the listenership it has, it makes a lot more sense to have a ton of different revenue streams that all come in and if one of them disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. And then I will say also that one of the reasons you don't want to be focused on money from the beginning is because it'll make you compromise. If you are relying on this thing to pay the bills, you won't even be able to figure out how to find your own voice because you'll have pressure to do things. And you're like, well, I normally wouldn't want to talk to this person, but they're going to pay this and that, or I wouldn't do this and that, but they're going to pay. And then next thing you know, your project is just at the whims of whoever has money. And the good thing for me was I spent really about 6 years figuring out what I was making, and it's very unique. And then people offered to pay me for that. It wasn't the other way around. I wasn't seeking things out. So again, man, I'm not trying to discourage anybody or, be down about the money, but I think the longer you can delay worrying about money, the better. Think of it as a creative project. And again, if you want to learn more about that, come on Free Flow with me. So last thing, some books, readings, resources, things that you can check out that will help you kind of learn more about all this. None of them are related to audio engineering or asking questions or anything. They're all kind of more philosophical, but I think everything by Seth Godin is worth reading, specifically Purple Cow, Tribes, This is Marketing, and The Practice. He also has a book that is free that I mentioned earlier called Unleashing the Idea Virus. That's a really, really good book. It was one of his first, and he just put it out on the internet for free with the idea that if it's good, it'll spread. And it spread and spread and spread. And that's one of the texts that I ask incoming students at Free Flow to read. There is Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art. I think that is a great book that kind of will help you get out of your own way if you are struggling to get this work done. And it's kind of I think in the back it says a kick in the pants. And that's what it is. And it just is going to be hard. It'll be uncomfortable. It's awful listening to yourself talk, the whole deal. But if it's something you want to do, you just got to do it. And you got to figure out a way to do it. He also wrote a really short book that's available for free online. And the title is pretty funny. It's Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit. And it's, Stephen Pressfield, before he became a novelist, he was a copywriter in the ad world. And he just lays out this idea that, look, nobody wants to read your stuff. And it's like I say that with podcasts. Nobody wants to listen to a new podcast. I think about what it takes for a new podcast to make its way into my podcast queue. I'm not looking for a new podcast. And so he talks about, you got to create this amazing work that is completely unique, that connects with a very few number of people, and that you somehow break through all the noise and catch their attention, and then they do want to listen to it. But I think by approaching the podcast or whatever you're doing with this idea of nobody wants to listen to this thing, nobody's looking for this, and if anything, they're trying to keep it away from them. How do I create something that's going to add value or add enough value that they're going to want to listen to it? And I think that humility and that reality of how crowded everything is will really force you to make a better product and make something that matters and helps and connects with people. Again, generosity. Adam Grant wrote a book called Originals, and the part that I remember from the book is he talks about creative people and people who have managed to be successful in creative work, and they make a lot of stuff. And the vast majority of it is not great, but every now and then something hits. But the common theme is that they do a lot, and they're prolific. And I think whether you're writing blog posts or whether you're making podcasts or whatever, volume is very, very, very important. You want it to be good. You want it to be high quality. You want it to be at a pace that you can be proud of what you're putting out, but the more the better, because you never know what's going to hit. No musician makes a record thinking, oh, this will probably be mid-level. Everybody's trying to do their best when they're putting out these creative works. It's just kind of up to the universe and luck whether or not it hits or not. So I think that's important. There's another one called 1,000 True Fans by Kevin Kelly. It's an essay, and it's about this idea of if you can establish 1,000 true fans, people that love what you do, they'll buy anything you sell. They're super fans. They're completely bought in. If you can do that, you can make a living doing this work, doing creative work. And it can be across the board: books, podcasts, blogs, movies, videos, whatever. So I'll link to that one. As far as interviews, I love Conan O'Brien. I think, he's silly and crazy and acts nuts and all that kind of stuff, but he is a really good interviewer. And before he started his podcast a long time ago, he started doing this thing on YouTube where we would have serious conversations with people like historians, musicians. He had Edmund Morris, who wrote the Theodore Roosevelt trilogy. And then he had Jack White from the White Stripes, all these amazing people. And I used to watch those, and it was just such interesting conversations. And I learned a lot by watching those. And I think that interview with Jack White is one of the best interviews I've ever seen anywhere. And so I thought those were great. I loved Charlie Rose. He got booted out of society because of being a bit of a creep. But if you can separate that, that stuff from the work, I think those interviews are really, really good. But again, your interview style is yours and yours alone. But I just love interviews. And so the more I can listen to, I feel like that helps. And we can talk about books all day. I can give you all these websites to visit, videos to watch. But at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that you start and that you continue. And do it again and again and again and again. Be prolific. Don't stop. Get confident. Keep cranking on it. There's no other way around it. I mean, unless you're plugged into the world of media, or you're a trained journalist, or you're connected with some big organization with a big following, then there might be a shortcut. But if you're like me, the only way to do it is to do it. And so I hope this helps. We're coming in at like an hour and a half, which is what I was expecting this would take. If anybody's still listening, thank you so much. Check out the episode notes. I'll have links to all this stuff, the spreadsheet, the books, all that kind of stuff. But I really hope this helps. It's everything I know. I don't know anything else. There's nothing. And if we went to lunch would be an hour. So this is an extra 30 minutes. And it may be too much. But if this helps one person stop planning and start recording and publishing, it is well worth it. But again, to all you Patreon supporters, thank you. You're the whole reason this thing goes, and I really appreciate it. I hope you all have a great spring, and I'll be in touch in a few weeks with another one of these Patreon podcasts. Thank you.